Being fed to crocodiles and smacked around with whips are some of the worst ways to go, so it's pretty easy to see why it was much easier to just abide by the law in ancient Egypt instead of receiving these 10 punishments. First on our list, being buried alive. This was a punishment that was certainly active in many ancient societies. It was actually used quite frequently in ancient Egypt as a form of capital punishment. While it is not known which criminals would receive this brutal form of punishment, we can only assume that it was used for very serious crimes. The Egyptians actually had tombs created that were dedicated to live burials for criminals, so it appears that this method was used more frequently than many people might think. Archaeologists have uncovered many Egyptian tombs over the years, but it turns out that some of them might have been the result of burial punishments. This was also a cost-effective way to deal with criminals that the government simply didn't want to deal with anymore. It was obviously very inhumane, but the Egyptian pharaohs saw this as a very effective method. Knowing that you could be buried alive for your bad decisions would definitely be an effective way to keep criminals from committing any more serious crimes. Next on our list is impalement. This one is exactly what it sounds like, and it is incredibly gruesome. This form of punishment was used for various types of major crimes such as adultery and grave robbing. It was definitely haunting the nightmares of many criminals in ancient Egypt. This type of punishment actually came in many different forms, as it could be used as capital punishment or very painful torture. The authorities would tie the convicted criminal to a post where they would then be impaled by a large spear. While the torturer would sometimes deliver a direct blow to the heart or brain for capital punishment, other times they would just take out a leg or an arm for torture purposes. This form of punishment would also sometimes be used on suspects who the authorities were pressing for answers during an investigation. Whether it was a death penalty or torture, the threat of impalement was just another way the authorities in ancient Egypt kept potential criminals in line. Up next we have hand amputations. Well, now that we've seen that ancient Egyptians were not afraid to use large spears for punishment, shouldn't be too surprising that they were willing to take things one step further. This gruesome form of punishment was originally invented for grave robbers who had been caught in the act. Now, grave robbing was a serious problem in ancient Egypt, as many people were interested in finding buried treasure that people had brought with them to the afterlife. Pharaohs realized that this was a huge problem, so they came up with a very scary tactic to deal with anyone who was caught in the act. Authorities were sometimes instructed to chop off the hands of any grave robber who was caught in the middle of their crime. They saw this as the most effective way to deter anyone from robbing a grave, as no one would ever want to live the rest of their lives without the use of their hands. After that, we have the beating of 100 blows. This was perhaps the longest and most grueling form of non-capital punishment that could be issued in ancient Egypt. This was another punishment that was initially created for grave robbers, but was eventually used to punish a wide range of petty thefts. First time grave robbers wouldn't always be subjected to an amputation, but there was another rough form of torture that was awaiting them instead. Authorities would gather in a group and deliver a grand total of 100 blows to the convicted criminal for their actions. It is not known how they settled on 100 as the magic number, but the guards would strike the criminal with whips while they were forced to endure the brutal pain. One heavy hit from a whip can leave anyone with a very nasty wound, so we can't even imagine how 100 of them must feel. Criminals would not be able to move after such a heavy beating, so this would obviously keep them away from any grave sites in the near future. Next up we have donkey torture. It turns out that donkeys played a major role in ancient Egypt's justice system. Now, just to be clear, this is nothing like pin the tail on the donkey, and nobody has any fun in this twisted scenario. This was another form of punishment that looked to punish grave robbers, but there was a very specific type of grave robber who had to face the donkey. The animals would be brought in to punish anyone who even attempted to rob the grave of a fallen pharaoh. While other robbers would be beaten or have their hands removed, these criminals who defaced the resting place of a pharaoh would be taken advantage of by a donkey. Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like, and it is absolutely disgusting. But even despite this terrible punishment potentially awaiting them, some people still decided to take the risk to try and rob the fallen pharaoh of their riches. Next on our list is burning. This is another pretty self-explanatory and equally brutal punishment. Burning was a common form of punishment that was often used for anyone who was caught in the act of adultery. Now, back in ancient Egypt, adultery was seen as one of the worst crimes a person could commit. Pharaohs and authorities saw this as a direct disruption to Egyptian society that brought tremendous shame to the ancient empire. Because of the strong views and opinions the empire had on adultery, the punishments that were handed out to anyone who was found guilty of the sin were beyond brutal. One of the punishments that the ancient empire used frequently was the simple method of burning. Authorities would light the criminal's body on fire until they sustained terrible burns or simply succumbed to their injuries. This meant that it was really a toss-up if the criminal would receive capital punishment or not. If they did survive the burning, however, the criminal would be left with terrible scars that they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. After that, we have slavery. This type of punishment was extremely common for criminals who were guilty of committing petty crimes. It was extremely common in ancient Egypt, and the convicted criminals would be forced into harsh physical labor in extremely hot conditions. Many of ancient Egypt's greatest structures, including the Great Pyramids, were built by slaves who were likely serving time for past crimes. And what some people would regard as being worse than a death sentence, some criminals would also be sold into slavery for extended periods of time. Many of the slaves would often pass away from injuries sustained during work or malnourishment, so casualties were very common during the construction of large monuments. Many viewed this work as just an elongated form of capital punishment, so this was widely regarded as one of the worst punishments a person could receive in ancient Egypt. Next up is crocodile feeding. This brutal form of capital punishment was mainly reserved for repeat offenders. It was often used for anyone who had been caught stealing valuables on multiple occasions. This would be the final form of punishment that they would ever receive. First-time offenders would usually just pay a fine and return the stolen goods, but they would also need to swear by an oath that they would never steal again. This meant that anyone who broke the oath would bring a great dishonor to the empire and would literally be tossed to the crocodiles. Now, while most people would listen to the warning and would never steal again, some decided to take their chances and return to their criminal ways. Maybe they thought they were calling the pharaoh's bluff, but this just wasn't a good decision. There was absolutely no chance of defending yourself if you went against the oath, and there was no way of escaping the crocodiles. This was by far one of the most gruesome ways a person could go in ancient Egypt. After that, we have ear and nose amputations. Authorities in ancient Egypt were not afraid to take away your senses if you were a bad citizen. While we've already heard of people having their hands cut off, others would face another form of amputation punishment if they were caught in the act of adultery. While the punishment for this crime came in various forms in ancient Egypt, one of the absolute worst of them all was a person having their nose and ears cut off. It's quite clear by now that ancient Egypt had no time for anyone who committed adultery, but some of these punishments were truly on another level. This type of amputation was meant to take away a person's vital senses, but it also ensured that it would negatively affect their appearance. The authorities wanted to make sure that no one would find the criminal attractive again, so removing body parts was their way of achieving this. Of course, losing your hearing and sense of smell also made this one of the worst punishments ever. And last but not least, we have drowning. Yet another straightforward punishment that was used for some of the worst criminals in the land. This technique was used by many ancient governments as a form of capital punishment, but it was reserved for some of the most hated citizens around. Anyone who had committed a major crime or was a repeat offender could have received this terrible fate. Drowning was also a symbolic way of showing that a particular criminal had absolutely no friends in society. Authorities didn't want to waste any time or resources on them and simply wanted them out of their lives as quickly as possible. The criminal would usually be tied to a stick to ensure they couldn't escape before they were tossed into the water. Not only would the criminal's life come to an abrupt and terrible ending, but they would also have to go out knowing that absolutely nobody liked them. This should have been a fair warning to any criminal that they need to make some very serious changes in their lives. And that covers our look at ancient Egypt's scariest punishments. There really were no small punishments in ancient Egypt, so it was best for everyone to just stay out of trouble. Thanks as always for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you all next time.